and thank you for joining us. My name is Jennifer Hill, and I'm a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center, or NCTC, in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. I also coordinate the Native Youth Climate Adaptation Leadership Congress, which is a week-long on-site program for Indigenous high school youth held at NCTC. Today, we welcome your questions and your comments anytime during the presentation. Please enter them into the chat or email them to broadcast@fws.gov. If we don't get to your comments or questions today, we'll do our best to follow up with you afterwards. Prior to introducing our guest speaker, I would like to acknowledge that the National Conservation Training Center is located on the ancestral lands of many Indigenous peoples. Due to the painful history of forceful removal, we could not find a full account of the Indigenous peoples who occupied the land that was taken from them. We are aware that many Indigenous peoples traversed, cherished, and lived on this land. They include, but are not limited to, the Maliseet, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. As we learn more about the Indigenous peoples who had and continue to have relationships with this land, we better appreciate the good earth on which we work, live, and learn. NCTC is committed to building and sustaining relationships by highlighting Indigenous communities, offering Indigenous-based webinars, and sponsoring programs and activities for Indigenous youth. And we encourage others to learn more about the land on which they work and reside. Today, we are going to hear from Peter Forbes. Peter's life work is about the courageous convening of people across differences of race, class, and ideology to resolve matters of consequence to their shared future. Peter is the co-founder of First Light, an ambitious effort between 65 organizations in Maine and the Wabanaki people to increase their presence and sovereignty on the land. He co-leads similar efforts between conservation organizations and Indigenous nations in Alaska and Oregon. Peter was also the founding director of the Center for Whole Communities and a vice president at Trust for Public Land. He is the author of 4 books on people and place and the owner of Knoll Farm, an organic fruit farm and community gathering place in the mountains of Vermont, where he and his partner Helen raised their family. Peter, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, we're excited to hear about the work you do and learn more about land justice efforts.
Well, it's an honor to be with you. Thank you for that very kind introduction.
Sure.
Should we launch? Does that feel good?
Take it away.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm so appreciative of your time. Regardless of what Jennifer said, the most important thing that I want you to know is that I am a learner around this work. Everything I'm about to describe to you has really evolved through human relationships, people coming to know one another, and the hard work of making mistakes along the way. I honor you for your time, your commitment, your presence in this. And I'm going to share my screen. How about that? I would suspect that there's going to be, a range of emotions on this topic of land justice. Curiosity, skepticism, longing, possibly shame and fear, and all of those emotions, frankly, are appropriate. I myself have felt all of them at one point or another in this work. And you will likely feel a lot of those even in this short presentation. A few words about voice and identity. I am not an Indigenous person. I don't represent Indigenous person. I'm a white man who's worked to transform the very privileged system of conservation and guide it towards using that privilege to liberate others and to liberate ourselves. So I'm indebted very much to the people you see in this picture, the many Indigenous teachers and non-Native guides who've helped me to see the world differently. Our Wabanaki colleague have also asked us non-native collaborators to do our own work first. And by that, I think it's a request to be really discerning about ourselves, our culture, our conservation movement, before asking really to learn about someone else's culture. Looking critically at oneself is the foundation of cultural humility. So our work at First Light is very, very much intentionally about white culture confronting white culture problems, because we think that's the essential first step in creating the conditions for Indigenous partnerships. And so no matter our backgrounds, most of us who work in conservation are working within right now a white system of conservation that many, many are trying to shift to become something different than white-led. But I'm speaking primarily today to that system as it exists in this moment. And so this work is really devoted to the questions you see right here. Can conservation, which many of us love and devoted our lives to, can it become a force in decolonizing America, or will conservation be the final frontier of that colonization? And to get to those questions, we really have to be willing to answer these. You know, who are insiders and outsiders to us? What are we protecting nature really from? And is conservation working? I want to say a word about geography too. I'm going to be talking about places and relationships affected by colonization for the longest period of time. And by that, I mean the northeast of this country. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Abenaki, Nipmuc, Pequot, Wampanoag have all survived 400 years of colonization. The longer the colonization, the greater the losses to culture. So this creates very, very different conditions for partnership than, say, Oregon or Alaska, where colonization has been more recent and cultural power not nearly as eroded. For example, those of you know Juneau, you know, the tallest building in downtown Juneau is owned by the Tlingit Nation. That's a really different level of power than one sees on Indian Island, Maine. Also, 90% of the land in Maine where First Light is based is privately owned. In Oregon, for example, it's closer to 20%. Therefore, if we can change the hearts and minds of private landowners in Maine, we can certainly move the needle in restoring land to tribes. This isn't quite so true in the American West. So I want to share a couple of really important understandings with you. This is a map of Indigenous land loss in the United States. Take this in. I want to show it to you one more time. Whoop, can't do that. Sorry about that. You got the idea. Though powerfully dispossessed of land and lifeways, still oppressed today, those people, their ecological experience, still here, very much so. To lose the land or to be blocked access to it physically or culturally is to lose forms of power. To lose one's relationship to land is to lose oneself. So I know many of you on this call know this. I'm saying this for the ones who maybe don't. An estimated 18 million Indigenous people were custodians of North America when the colonists arrived. Today, there are just over 5 million Indigenous people here. And those 5 million, they remain powerful for many, many reasons, at the basis of which is the mere fact that they have survived. So under that crust of that portion of the earth that is called the United States of America, from California to the Gulf Stream's waters, right, are in turn the bones, the villages, the fields, and sacred objects of America's first peoples. So how might acknowledging the reality of that history transform society? So here's a map of conservation land gain, okay? A map of conservation land gain in the same time period as that map that I showed you before? How might acknowledging this history transform the practice of conservation? So for me personally, these sacrifices made by Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, well, they're just a huge, huge part of what made our conservation movement and made me as a human being. And I want to make amends. And I think a lot of people want to make amends. And I believe that our conservation movement is mature enough to recognize this as well. And I'm going to be sharing with you a story of how that has unfolded in one particular place. I want to bring you all to that place, the state of Maine. It's actually a really unlikely place for cultural reconciliation to happen. First of all, most of Maine is overwhelmingly white. I think it's the most likely in Maine if you're a child in elementary school to be in a class that is entirely white. It's also the oldest population. All the Wabanaki communities exist within Trump country today, and 90% of that land is privately owned. And so here's what I've learned out of that. Wabanaki presence in Maine is continuous, despite that history of colonization. Wabanaki people are living on Indian Island, on Matukmatuk, on Peter Dana Point, Sabayak. They're all living on ground that their ancestors lived on. A continuous lineage of presence of some 13,000 years. No one else anywhere north of Cape Cod or east of Syracuse, New York can say that. And Wabanaki population is substantial. If all 12,000 Wabanaki people were living in one place, which of course they're not, it would be considered a big Maine town. But they're relegated to small reservations out of sight to most Mainers. And yet still their stewardship of the land is time-tested and time-proven. For example, the Penobscot River Restoration Project, which is a project to remove some dams on the Penobscot River, it is the most important natural resource achievement in modern times in Maine. And that was led by Penobscot people. And yet, until quite recently, the culture of the conservation movement that I was raised in, that's there in Maine, hasn't cared very much about Wabanaki people. Our sense of history, our property signs, our boards, our staffs, our funders have all made it appear that Wabanaki people basically don't exist. And it's true that Maine's rivers and mountains still carry some Wabanaki names, and those words and phrases, Umbagog, Metawaska, Kenduske, Katahdin, they arose from the land itself to become Maine's first language. But the people and the stories that those names belong to, yeah, they were relegated to small reservations out of sight of most Mainers. And after 400 years of colonization, broken treaties, the Wabanaki now have access to less than 1% of the territory that once supported their place-based cultures. But in my lifetime, in the last 50 years, conservation groups in Maine have come to steward almost 23% of the state, and there's the opportunity. Because in those lands stewarded by private conservation groups are countless places of great importance to Wabanaki people whose burial grounds and neighborhoods are now our white culture's second homes, our nature preserves, state and national parks. Who owns the keys to these places of utmost importance to Wabanaki people? Well, the answer to that is really clear. Dominant white culture owns those keys. People like me do. People who run these conservation organizations do. And once we've understood those consequences, intentional or not, and once they are within our awareness, we have a responsibility to make amends. Why do we have that responsibility? That's a good question, right? Well, I would say there are moral and there are strategic reasons why we have a moral responsibility. And the moral reasons are, they're unique to each of us, and it may take a lifetime to unpack those. The strategic reasons are much more clear and immediate. I would say, do scientists and conservationists and environmentalists, do we really believe we have all the answers to saving the planet? And, quite honestly, has our Western approach to protecting nature proven to be completely correct? Is the planet actually doing better as a result of 100 years of Western conservation? And I would say if your answer is, I'm not sure, or no, or even maybe, then working closely with indigenous people, with Wabanaki communities in Maine specifically, is the most direct way to bring into land stewardship, into land relationship, perspectives and knowledge that are more time-tested and durable. I really want to make a point on this from Oregon. So here's an aerial photograph of the bootleg fire from Oregon 2 summers ago. You remembered it. It killed 4 people, destroyed 162 homes, changed the biodiversity of 400,000 acres. So on the right there is, that's land with no particular treatment to it, and what the fire did to that. The land to the far left, that was managed just by the Nature Conservancy. The land in the middle there that still has green is land that was managed in a 25-year plan between the Klamath tribe and the Nature Conservancy. So I know that I'm motivated to have relationships with people whose understanding of my home ground is different than mine, more nuanced than mine, has more time behind it. So as all of us who are non-native, we're seeking a deeper connection to landscape, no matter where that is, I would say our own relationship to place is greatly diminished and stunted by our separation from indigenous people. No one, in my view, can move forward without making amends on that history. And who we are as conservationists is, without a relationship to indigenous people is really questionable to me. And so to center Wabanaki people and their worldview in the work of conservation is really, it's big stuff. It's about building the muscle and the organizational competency to work with many other kinds of, many other groups of people who have been neglected by dominant culture. For those of us in Maine, connecting meaningfully with Wabanaki has made all of these conversations both possible and unavoidable. I want to read you this poem that was given to us 4 years ago by the Passamaquoddy healer, Mother Tribal Council member Natalie Dana Lolar. In this time of posted land, where do we go? How do we live? No food and medicine gathered, no game honorably killed and eaten. In this time of posted land, where can we go without being shot at? Can we live sustainably? How do we maintain our culture? No sweetgrass picked, no ash fallen. In this time of posted land, where can we go? Where is our place? How can we live interconnected? How do we maintain us as a people? No lands to move seasonally. No way to maintain our ancestors' way of life. In this time of posted land, where can we look for help? Who can we call upon as our allies? Who do we know who to trust? How do we know who to trust? No continual ancestry land, no way to move about. In this time of posted land, is there hope? Not only do I believe there's hope, I know there's hope. I have seen that hope. Here is what is actually possible. That's a short video I took just, I don't know, 3-4 months ago on the summer solstice when the Passamaquoddy tribe celebrated the return of a very, very important island called ktahkomiq that they asked First Light to protect and return to them, which we did. And you'll learn more about the we in just a moment. But we sprang into action. We acquired that land. We returned it without cost and without any restrictions on it, without conservation easement on it, to the Passamaquoddy people so that their life ways could continue there. And we've made commitments which we are fulfilling to complete more than $10 million in acquisitions that are just similar to this. So what I want to share very, very quickly is how did we get there? And what we call land justice or land back or First Light, if you will, it's much, much more than just doing individual land transactions for tribes. Thankfully, that important work has been going on for decades. The conservation movement has been slowly rebuilding its relationships with indigenous people for some time, and there have been positive things and negative things that have come from that. But the Nature Conservancy, TPL, Conservation Fund, all, at the national level, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the Park Service, of course, have done significant, important collaborations to expand indigenous stewardship. All of that has been good. But what we're talking about is something really different. First Light is a different approach. It's a sustained effort to move beyond these individual projects toward a collective, sustained effort where the conservation movement relearns history, recenters indigenous voice and worldview in our work, and uses our power, our money, to build indigenous capacity so that we can collaborate together on a whole range of projects. And these efforts have these three things in common: a commitment on the non-native side to work collectively, not just one organization, but dozens and even hundreds of organizations, a commitment to organizational change, and then a commitment to focus on indigenous prosperity and self-determination, not just conservation. So I hope it's clear that First Light isn't a program that conservation is due for somebody else, for indigenous communities. First Light is actually conservation and Wabanaki communities coming together to change each other. It's a process of organizational change on our side and building the capacity on the indigenous side to create a practice of caring for the land that is more inclusive, more durable, more successful for nature than what Western white culture alone has been able to achieve. I hope you are all able to hear that. Today, First Light is really described through these three verbs: relearn, recenter, and return. And I want to try to describe those to you. Relearning is really the first step toward mutually rewarding collaboration, right? And relearning never ever stops. In the last 2 years, we've done 27 different learning experiences that have elevated Wabanaki voice. And here's some posters from all of them. doing everything we can to bring elders, youngers, Wabanaki musicians, Wabanaki foresters, elevating their voice, giving them a platform to share their experience. And what we in the non-native world are learning is empathy, humility, understanding two-eyed seeing, and how our different worldviews can help caring for the land. And plus these trainings, and we also go on 3 different canoe expeditions together every year. They create human connections between non-native people and native people and across native tribes. And these connections build into stronger, longer-term mutual relationships. This is how we come to trust one another, really, to believe in one another. So the other part of this, right, is recentering. 400 years of colonization has separated me and people who look like me from Wabanaki people. Conservation has been isolated from other knowledge and worldviews that might hold greater insights about what nature and people really need. And I want to say that this is, recentering is different than asking a Wabanaki person or an indigenous person to sit on our panels or sit on our boards, to join our clubs. Recentering is about creating the funding for Wabanaki to have their own panels, their own boards among themselves, to build their power, to share with conservation their direction, their wisdom. And for example, we raise about $150,000 each year to fund an intertribal commission, the Wabanaki Commission, that builds voice and decision-making people for decision-making power for all Wabanaki. So together, all of us within First Light are raising $1 million solidarity deposit and committing to a much larger fund to help Wabanaki people reconnect to the land that has been returned to them. And that's called the Wabanaki Self-Determination Fund. And we hope that it becomes in the budget of every single conservation organization, private and public, operating in Maine. So all of that is really about recentering, right? And so I want to talk to you also about returning. It's such an interesting word, returning, and it's an interesting idea. What does it mean to return something? For First Light, returning is more nuanced than simply returning land. It's about restoring and sharing decision-making, knowledge, access, money, and yeah, definitely land too. And our experience so far is that absolutely every one of us, native, non-native, has benefited tangibly from doing this. Here's what returning means for First Light in Maine. We've done all of these things. Acquired and returned 1,500 acres without costs, without easements. We've granted legal access to another 58,000 acres. We've raised money. We've introduced our Wabanaki colleagues to our funders. We're exploring co-management of land. We do private benefit concerts, all kinds of different things. And every year we're learning more how to be allies to one another. Today, at this moment, we just hired a new staff person, a tribal lands recovery person, whose job is to work directly with the 5 tribes to make sure that a $10 million backlog of land return projects gets completed this year alone. Finally, I guess I want to say something about just meeting the gestalt of the moment, and by that I mean meeting the significance of the moment that we're in. I want you to go back for a moment and remember the spring and summer of 2020, the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, the national reckoning on race, all of these things created the conditions for this project that I'm telling you about, First Light, to grow from a pretty small effort, maybe just 15 organizations, to more than 65 organizations and more than 150 leaders, all signing board resolutions committing to making contributions into this fund, but also committing to returning land. And of course, Wabanaki people have never, ever stopped fighting for their land. But suddenly in Maine, there were dozens and dozens of landholding organizations and hundreds of white leaders who were actually listening. And together we've created this, I will say, an authentic pathway for progressive people and their organizations to move forward together in really respectful ways, and for Wabanaki leaders to build their collective voice around the needs, their needs for land. And this is what it looks like. And at the very center of these concentric circles is the Wabanaki Commission on Land. There are bosses, and the next circle out is a delegation of community-based conservation organizations. There are actually 8 organizations that are in that, and they contribute staff and money to respond to every request that's made of us from the Wabanaki Commission. And then beyond them is maybe 40 different organizations, we call them ambassador organizations, who all have made these board level commitments to return land, but maybe haven't quite done it yet. So they're preparing themselves and working their way into it. And what distinguishes this work, right, is collective action, 65 organizations. And we're committing to working collectively because the understanding is that we are stronger together, that many of us might be able to achieve what no one of us could do. And when we work together, the Nature Conservancy, Trust for Public Land, Maine Coast Heritage Trust, when we work together, we put all of those individual names aside and we call ourselves First Light. And that's to show our solidarity with Wabanaki tribes and to put our shared values and commitments ahead, get this, ahead of our organizational identities and branding. And that's the most important part of all of this, is that those values and our commitments to our Wabanaki colleagues are more important to us than anything else. And so now perhaps you're beginning to understand how this work is much, much bigger than conservation. Our real work together is about deep narrative change. Together, we're trying to create a new story about what conservation can do and for whom, and everyone is going to benefit from that. Together, we're adding to conservation's Western concepts of science and stewardship a Wabanaki worldview of presence and relationship. We're moving beyond leave no trace to how about leave a beautiful trace. And together we're creating really practical examples of cultural reconciliation through access to land. All people, native, non-native, will deepen their relationship to this place called Maine as Wabanaki knowledge and presence on the land is expanded. We know that that's true. The land itself is going to grow healthier because of that. All people in Maine are going to benefit. So to those, and there are those, definitely, there are those in Maine who look at all of this work, and absolutely there are those, maybe on this call, who hear this work and say, man, that is mission creep. That's okay, because that's the debate that you need to be having. There are also many, many hundreds of people in Maine and all across the country who call this work mission maturity. It is the work of conservation becoming stronger, more inclusive, more resilient, more relevant to the future. Finally, I want us to look at the larger moment. Look at the moment we're in. The Department of the Interior, the National Park Service are now led by Indigenous leaders. What does it mean to have the Park Service headed by Chuck Sams, one of our nation's scholars on Indigenous land loss? I think that's such an extraordinary moment that we're in, from the very, very local possibilities of reconciliation to the very, very top of our public agencies. So through this collective effort to find meaning and mutually fulfilling relationships with Indigenous communities, some of us in the land trust movement are refining our own relevancy, responding to the gestalt of this moment and really growing quite stronger as a result. I want to end there and see if you all have any thoughts or questions for me.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate that.
My pleasure, Jennifer. How does it work out in there in your technology land? Can we hear from people, or are we going to hear questions come in?
Questions will come in. You'll see me turn my head. I'm not paying attention. I'm actually looking at my other screen to see the questions pop up.
Okay, great.
So I just want to make that clear. I feel like I have
stunned
personal
everyone into silence.
Oh, no.
Go ahead, Jennifer. I'm sorry.
Sorry. No. I feel like I will have questions for you after I absorb all of this. But there are a couple that have come in so far. So we have Russ Cohen. He says, on a recent trip to Cobb's-Cook Bay in August, I took notice of many choke cherry bushes loaded with ripe fruit. I know this species is eaten by plains tribes, but Peter, do you know if the Passamaquoddy eat this fruit as well?
Russ, I'm not an expert in that. The Passamaquoddy that I hang with certainly do, and they use them for other things like dyeing materials, but there are probably lots of other uses that I'm not aware of. Yeah, but thank you for that.
Yeah, and he also asked, is Peter aware of any initiatives to re-indigenize landscapes? For example, to restore species of native plants with food and or medicinal values to lands where they once grew, but were removed by colonists?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do. So, our relationship, this collaboration that I just described to you with Wabanaki people is mature enough now that we've delineated our roles. Our Wabanaki colleagues have said, it's the job of non-native people to raise money, return land, do these real estate transactions, get land back into Indigenous ownership, and it's the role of Indigenous people to rematriate with that land. And by that, I think it's meant to re-indigenize, to reestablish human relationships, reestablish plant relationships. And that's what that fund that I mentioned to you is going to go to, is rematriation, Indigenous rematriation of that land. And there's also, in Wabanaki country, efforts to look at the effects of climate change on sweetgrass, on ash. There's a lot going on in the one part of the country that I know well, so I'm going to assume that there's a lot going on in other Indigenous parts of this country around this topic of rematriation or re-indigenation of the land itself.
Thank you. So Joy Keene is wondering, are there any wilderness-focused or Leave No Trace organizations in the First Light community?
Well, also, that's also a really great question. So I would say that, yeah, absolutely. There are groups like the Northeast Wilderness Trust who's involved and in First Light. And we've had a lot of really good conversations about what does wilderness mean in an indigenous context. And Wabanaki people have a deep, as I understand it, from being a non-native person, a deep, deep appreciation of human forbearance and leaving some parts of nature alone, but they also feel erased by Western concepts of wilderness that don't place them on the landscape itself. So yeah, we've had a lot of fruitful, as you can imagine, conversations. And we had a whole program called Hands Working Together that looked at the concept of Leave No Trace as being a European construct that comes from a culture rooted in consumption that believes it can only destroy land. And Wabanaki people don't believe in Leave No Trace. They believe in leave a beautiful trace. And so in the non-native part of First Light, we've been learning a lot about, okay, well, what does it mean to leave a beautiful trace when my culture has pretty much primarily just shown the capacity to destroy a place. So your question's getting at the heart of some of the challenge of bringing these worlds together and learning from each other. I hope that makes some sense to you and helps.
All right, so Leah is wondering, or comments, as federal agencies, the essential, delicate, long-term relationship and trust building that is needed for this vision and work is often impacted by political shifts. Mm-hmm. How do we overcome this?
Yeah, wow, what a great question. Their First Light is made up, I've said this ad nauseum, right? 65 organizations. There's a federal agency in it, the National Park Service. There's 2 state agencies in it, Bureau of Public Lands. And so, and the people, the individuals who represent those organizations and those agencies, we work with them primarily. And we bring along as many different people in the agency as we possibly can, so that vagaries and politics, when they come, there's always a core group working within an agency that is still connected to First Light and connected to these stories and values. So while we're working with big state agencies, the answer is we're primarily working with specific people and keeping those relationships going through political wins.
So I am curious, what led you to do the work that you're doing today? How did you get to this point?
That's an interesting question. I would say that I am doing this work today because I am a first-generation American, and my father came here speaking a different language, having a different last name, and he changed everything, including giving me the last name Forbes, so that maybe one day I could be on a Zoom with a whole bunch of people talking about identity. I care about identity because I've seen how land conservation in the United States has been largely an insider's game. You know, it's benefited certain people, and other people have been left out of it. And I've been an insider to that, and I've also been an outsider to it. And that has, I think, set me on a path to really understanding or aspiring to really understand what does it take to include all people in this work, and what does it take of white culture to do that, and what is the reconciling that needs to occur. And I'm also a farmer, and so my own personal relationships with the land have gone beyond recreation, you know, to be about sustenance, you know, how I feed my family and how I help to feed other families. And that has connected me to all kinds of people who in America who care deeply, deeply about nature, but feel excluded from the conservation movement. Thank you for asking that question. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. It looks like Virginia is asking, does First Light have any specific programs or opportunities for supporting Indigenous youth leaders in the work that you are doing?
Oh, wow, another great question. We do. We have a young Penobscot man on staff. His name is Lakota Sanborn, and his job is to organize young Wabanaki people to find their voice around needs around land. And the really interesting thing is, you know, there's been so many, I'm constantly learning the impacts of colonization, right? And one of them is often when white people want to engage with Indigenous people at some kind of official level, we end up working with one segment of indigeneity. And it's easy to stay focused on that segment of indigeneity. And maybe that segment doesn't include youth, or maybe it doesn't include gatherers, maybe it doesn't always include women, maybe it doesn't include elders, you know. And it's our Wabanaki colleagues who really, the Wabanaki Commission is mostly Wabanaki people who work for tribal governments. And they have specifically asked us to work hard to engage other segments of their own communities, in particular youth, and in particular gatherers. And there's no particular goal around that organizing except to build voice, you know, to make sure that those particular populations have a way to express their needs around access to land and land itself.
Okay. All right, we've got another one in here. Oh, here we go. Okay. So Bronwyn is adding to Russ's question on land that is still in non-Indigenous hands, like national parks, forests, or refuges, or in land trust. Are there efforts to bring culturally important species back before land return?
Yeah. So what is land return, right? You know, I mean, to us, land return is not just the returning of real estate. It's the returning of access. It's the returning of many, many things. So there's a lot of really good examples. Like in Maine with the Park Service, like Acadia National Park is doing really fantastic work giving access to Wabanaki people for harvesting sweetgrass and other particular species, and making sure that those species exist and are protected just for Wabanaki use. That's like very, very important stuff. And was going on before, the origins of that were going on before First Light really started, and they'll continue and be spread. But we think access is the most important thing before land return, because access leads to relationship. And really what we're talking about here is not just the return of land, it's the return of relationships. Relationships between Wabanaki people and land, yeah, for sure, but also the return of relationships between Wabanaki people themselves and non-Wabanaki people themselves. And that has to begin with privately owned non-Indigenous land being opened for Indigenous access. That's our number one goal at First Light. And because 90% of Maine is privately owned, there's a lot of opportunity to really move the needle there on that.
All right. This is so much to take in. Okay, so Peter talked about, so this is also from Bronwyn. Peter talked about the rematriation on land that has been returned to the Wabanaki communities. But is it all possible, I think, is it at all possible in places where the land return is still in process or not going to happen?
Well, yeah, Bronwyn, what great questions. One hopes and needs that, right? I mean, we need to have that opportunity. We're learning as we go. And one of the things that I can barely say the words to you, and I don't yet really understand the full significance of it, but I'll share it because it's something that we do talk about. You know, as we develop a better, really trusting relationship between Wabanaki and non-Wabanaki people, we are beginning to have conversations about our roles in helping each other to reconnect to the land of Maine. And so I have heard Wabanaki people say, it is your role, non-native person, to return land because that is necessary for me to re-indigenize with that land. And you, non-native person, you could never re-indigenize, but you might be able to naturalize to this place called Maine. But you can't achieve that without a relationship with a Wabanaki person. So I know that I just said a mouthful, and maybe you didn't follow all of that because I'm basically not following it. But it's these concepts that we collectively have a role to play in helping us, native and non-native, to find our place on the land again. And while I, as a non-native person, am never going to be able to indigenize to a place, I hope to be able to naturalize there. And I can't naturalize to that land without an authentic, trusting relationship with a Wabanaki person. I don't know if that makes any sense to all of you there, but that kind of human to human then becomes the foundation for why we are also our organizations returning land. Because all of us want to have a different relationship to each other and to this land that is called Maine.
I think that this question may relate to what you just are speaking about, but are there, well, I think there's a lot in that question, or in that comment. I'm wondering if you are or have ideas of how non-Indigenous individuals might demonstrate solidarity with Indigenous individuals beyond this topic that we're talking about.
Beyond like the project of First Light.
Right. Yeah. Let's say not all of us have that ability.
Sure. Yeah, we don't have organizations that are willing to engage and all of that. Totally. So speaking just of individual non-Indigenous people, relearn history. You know, learn. For me, I had to learn a history that I was never ever taught, and I could tell you the books that have really helped me, and there've been many, but I think People's History of Indigenous America is probably the most recent one, and then there's a lot of like local ones to Maine. Then after that, really reading the treaties of my geography to understand what was promised and never delivered on. I think that's been really important. And then show up for individual Indigenous people in whatever their projects are. Show up as a volunteer, you know, show up for their celebrations, be present. You know, let them know by your presence that you care and that you're doing everything you can to relearn things and to stand beside them in whatever way you can.
Thank you. All right, it looks like we have one more, and I think that'll be about the time. Allison in Carlsbad, California. I'm probably going to mispronounce this. The Kumeyaay Nation tribes here have a land conservancy.
Yes.
It seems like your model would be very useful. Do you know of any national programs that could help us here?
Oh, so is Allison with the Kumeyaay Land Trust?
I'm not positive from the...
Okay. Well,
but she is in Carlsbad, California.
Yeah. Well, to answer the immediate question, I don't know of one in Southern California, no. But I do know that land trust. I know that Indigenous land trust, and I have high regard for them. And I think that there is an effort in Northern California right now that's modeled on First Light, that brings together lots and lots of, you know, white-led conservation groups to return money and land. And, you know, my hope is that something like that would be organized in Southern California too. And I believe very, very strongly in collective action and in that these organizations that I was raised in, we're never going to change one organization at a time. We're only going to change when we work together to change ourselves. So First Light is doing that in Maine. You know, we really want to export the model. Anyone who's interested in all of our educational materials are free and available on our website. We're doing everything we can while keeping our nose in Maine, you know, to share what we're learning and encourage others to have this kind of sustained, thoughtful, collective approach to change making.
All right. And Allison she's with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She's a tribal coordinator.
Oh, great. Yeah. Well, I hope to meet Allison one day. But I know the Kumeyaay Land Trust. I've interacted with them before, and you know, that's the growth of Indigenous land trusts is a really positive, exciting thing for all of us who care about centering indigeneity in conservation in the United States. So I just want to thank you. Thank you for organizing this, Jennifer, and all your colleagues. And thank you all who are on this. I'm sorry it's in this format where we can't shake hands or even see each other, but I am thinking of you and I'm grateful for your time and presence.
Thank you. We appreciate your time. This is exciting to hear about, so we appreciate you taking the time to spend with us today.
An honor. Yep. Take care, everyone.
You too. And
Bye,
for
Jennifer.
Joining us, I just want to remind you in December, we will be hosting a special Indigenous Connections broadcast. Typically, we skip December, but for this month, we are going to highlight the blessing of the Lumi Nation Carver's Totem Pole, which now resides at the National Conservation Training Center. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. The broadcast will be hosted on Wednesday, December 14th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and we'll be sending out a notice about that. And lastly, just as a reminder, each broadcast is recorded and available on NCTC's website. So if you wish to learn more about past recordings or future broadcasts or be added to the email list, please just contact me, Jennifer Hill. That's Jennifer_Hill at fws.gov. And we appreciate everyone joining today, and we hope to see you in December.